There was an extraordinary error that Rudolf Steiner had observed, an error that had truly frightened him when he realized its magnitude and implications. And this mistake was made not by ordinary people who simply lived their lives without genuine spiritual awareness. It was committed specifically by those who considered themselves religious, those who considered themselves observant, those who considered themselves dedicated to a genuine spiritual practice. And particularly, Steiner had observed that this error was extraordinarily prevalent among those who observed the Sabbath, those who saw themselves as Adventists or Sabbatarians, or those who had any tradition of Sabbath observance. And the error was so fundamental, so contrary to the true spiritual purpose of the Sabbath, that Steiner had been genuinely frightened to contemplate how this error had been perpetuated through generations, how it had crystallized into dogma, how it had become the norm. And therefore, Steiner urgently wanted people to understand this. He wanted them to awaken to the genuine truth about the Sabbath and what it truly meant to observe it. According to Steiner, the fundamental error was this, that most people who observed the Sabbath, who considered themselves Sabbath keepers, were focused absolutely on the external dimension, the material dimension, the ordinary dimension of the Sabbath. They were focused on which days it was allowed to work and which days it was not. They were focused on what activities were allowed and what activities were prohibited. They were focused on external rules, on behavioral compliance, on following a series of regulations. And all of this focus on the external, material, ordinary dimensions was a complete distraction from the true spiritual meaning of the Sabbath. It was a complete misrepresentation of what the Sabbath really was, and Steiner taught that when you focused only on these external aspects, when you were busy following rules about what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, you were completely missing the point. You were completely failing to access the genuine spiritual work that should have been happening during the Sabbath. Steiner had an extraordinarily deep understanding of the spiritual nature of the Sabbath. According to Steiner, the Sabbath was not simply an ordinary day when you were not supposed to work. It was actually a specific point in the weekly cycle when certain extraordinary spiritual works were able to take place. It was a time when the barriers between the ordinary physical world and the spiritual worlds became extraordinarily thin. It was a time when it was possible to access understanding and awareness that were ordinarily inaccessible. And therefore, the true purpose of the Sabbath, the true spiritual meaning of the Sabbath, was to create space and time in which you could engage with genuine spiritual realities. I was able to access spiritual knowledge. He was able to consciously work on his own spiritual development. I was able to participate in genuine transformation processes that were not ordinarily possible. But Steiner taught that this was absolutely the opposite of what most people who kept the Sabbath were actually doing. According to Steiner, when you spent the Sabbath focused on rules, when you were constantly trying to follow regulations about what was allowed, your mind was occupied with ordinary concerns. His attention was fixed on the material level, on the level of behavioral restrictions, and therefore, you could not truly raise your consciousness. You could not truly access the higher spiritual realms. You couldn't truly do the spiritual work that the Sabbath was designed to allow. In fact, you were literally stopping yourself from doing this work. You were closing the door to that genuine transformation, and all in the name of keeping the Sabbath. And this was what scared Steiner. It was tragic irony. It was the fundamental contradiction. It was that those who considered themselves most observant were often those who were least able to access the true spiritual work that the Sabbath offered. According to Steiner, the real error, the fatal error, was this, that most people had identified Sabbath observance with behavioral conformity, with following rules, with not doing things that were forbidden. And therefore, they had developed a mindset that was entirely focused on the negative, focused on not doing, focused on restriction, focused on limitation. But the Sabbath genuinely wasn't about denial. It wasn't about restriction. It wasn't about what you couldn't do. It was about what you could do. It was about the extraordinary opportunity that Saturday presented. It was about creating space for genuine transformation. It was about raising your consciousness. It was about genuine spiritual work. Steiner also taught that there was a historical reason why this error had developed. According to Steiner, a perversion had occurred over the centuries. Those who had power, those who wanted to control people through religion, had deliberately transformed the concept of Sabbath from something that was deeply spiritual into something that was primarily material and regulatory. They had deliberately emphasized the rules, the restrictions, what was allowed and what was not. Because in this way, when people's minds were completely occupied with regulations, when they were entirely focused on conformity, they were not able to do genuine spiritual work. They were not able to access genuine spiritual liberation. They were not capable of truly awakening spiritually, and therefore they continued to sleep. I continued to live lives that were governed by dogma rather than genuine understanding. They continued to be controlled through fear of breaking rules, fear of doing something forbidden, fear of not observing properly. And here is what Steiner wanted you to deeply understand. The true Sabbath, the genuine spiritual Sabbath, was an extraordinary gift that had been given to humanity. It was a gift whose magnitude was almost impossible to exaggerate. It was a sacred opportunity. It was a special time within the weekly cycle, when extraordinary things managed to happen. When genuine transformation could occur, when genuine spiritual evolution could happen on a level that was ordinarily impossible. But when you spent your entire Saturday focused on rules and restrictions, when your mind was occupied with, can I do this, or I can't do that, you were completely wasting the gift. You were completely missing the opportunity. You were completely failing to enjoy what should be the most sacred moment of your week. Steiner also had a very specific teaching about what the true focus of the Sabbath should be. According to Steiner, the Sabbath should be a time for genuine elevation of consciousness. It should be a time when you deliberately disconnected from the ordinary concerns, the ordinary demands, the ordinary tasks of the week. Not because it was forbidden to do work, but because you were consciously choosing to dedicate yourself to something much higher. You were consciously choosing to dedicate yourself to genuine spiritual transformation. And so the question you should be asking yourself during the Sabbath was not which activity is permitted and which is not. The question should be, how can I use this sacred time to genuinely raise my consciousness? How can I use this time to genuinely work on my spiritual development? How can I use this time to genuinely move closer to higher spiritual realities? Steiner also taught that there was very specific spiritual work that could and should be happening during the Sabbath. According to Steiner, when you detached yourself from ordinary demands, when you actually created space and time dedicated to spiritual transformation, your own spiritual being could activate in extraordinary ways. I was able to make contact with higher realities. I was able to access knowledge that was ordinarily inaccessible. I was able to participate in processes of genuine healing, genuine transformation, genuine evolution. But this required something very specific. It required genuine awareness. It required genuine intent. It required that you deliberately elevate yourself through contemplation, through meditation, through genuine connection with spiritual realities, that you deliberately rise above ordinary levels of consciousness. And this was absolutely the opposite of being busy following rules about what was allowed and what was not allowed. Steiner also offered a lesson on why error had become so prevalent. According to Steiner, there was a deep reason. People, naturally, preferred what was concrete. They preferred what was clear. They preferred what was measurable. And so when a set of rules was offered, when it was said, you can't do this on the Sabbath, you can do that, this was understandable. This was easy to follow. This was easy to measure. You can say, I kept the Sabbath because I didn't do work, or I kept the Sabbath because I didn't travel, or I kept the Sabbath because I followed these specific rules. But genuine spiritual work was much more subtle. It was much more difficult to measure. It was much more complex. It required genuine development of consciousness. It required cultivation of mental and emotional states, specific ions. It required practice and genuine dedication. And so, because it was difficult, people tended to avoid it. They tended to settle for what was easiest. They tended to focus on the rules because it made them feel like they were doing something, that they were observing properly, that they were being religious. Steiner also wanted you to understand the genuine consequence of this error. According to Steiner, when you spent your life, your entire life, focused on behavioral conformity, focused on following rules, you never truly awakened spiritually. You never really accessed genuine spiritual realities. You never really experienced genuine transformation. You remained asleep. I remained trapped in a mindset that was governed by dogma rather than genuine understanding. I remained limited by the external structures that I had accepted as truth. And this was what genuinely scared Steiner, because he could see that entire generations of people who considered themselves religious, were completely missing the very essence of what religion should be. I was completely missing the opportunity for genuine transformation that should be happening. Steiner also offered a teaching on the relationship between Adventist error and the broader structure of religious control. According to Steiner, there was a pattern that repeated itself across many religious traditions. The pattern was always the same. You started with genuine spiritual truths. You began with deep understanding of spiritual mysteries. You started with practices that really managed to transform consciousness. But then, over time, these truths and practices were gradually transformed. They were transformed into rules, and structures, and regulations. And the focus changed from how can I genuinely transform to am I following the rules properly? And in this way, through this gradual transformation, religion went from being an instrument of genuine liberation to being an instrument of control. And those who had created the control structures, those who had an interest in keeping people asleep and keeping people imprisoned, They were more than happy to encourage this focus on rules and restrictions. Steiner also taught that there was a completely different understanding of the Sabbath that was available, but that was rare among those who considered themselves Sabbath keepers. According to Steiner, if you really understood the deep spiritual meaning of the Sabbath, if you really understood what work was supposed to be happening, you would have a completely different focus. You wouldn't be focused on restrictions. You would be focused on elevation. You would be focused on transformation. You would be focused on accessing genuine spiritual realities. And the extraordinary paradox was that when you genuinely focused on this, when you truly devoted yourself to genuine spiritual work during the Sabbath, you naturally withdrew from those activities that were forbidden in any way, not because you were following a rule, but because those activities were completely inconsistent with the spiritual work you were doing. Therefore, behavioral restrictions, when understood correctly, was not the point. The point was genuine spiritual transformation, and when you focused on the genuine point, restriction naturally followed as a consequence. Steiner also had a very important teaching about who was especially mistaken. According to Steiner, there was a certain type of person who was particularly vulnerable to this error. He was that kind of person who liked rules, that he liked structure, who liked to know exactly what was expected. And for that kind of person, the system of rules surrounding the Sabbath was perfectly attractive, because it allowed them to feel like they were doing something right. It allowed them to measure their success in a concrete way. It allowed them to feel virtuous. I observe these rules, therefore I am a religious person. But, according to Steiner, this feeling of virtuosity was actually an illusion. It was a disguised prison. Because while you were congratulating yourself about following the rules, you were completely missing the genuine point. You were completely failing to do genuine spiritual work. You were completely living a life of religious delusion. Steiner also offered teachings on how to recognize if you were falling into this error. According to Steiner, there were certain signs. One sign was if you spent Saturday primarily preoccupied with the question, am I observing adequately? If it was constantly on your mind, is this allowed? Or is this prohibited? If your consciousness was dominated by behavioral regulations. Another sign was if you rarely or never experienced a genuine elevation of consciousness during the Sabbath. If not, there was a feeling of genuine transformation taking place. If there was just a feeling of conformity. Third sign was if you felt fear of breaking the rules, fear of not observing properly, fear of being judged. Because, according to Steiner, true spirituality was never based on fear. It was based on genuine love, on genuine understanding, on genuine transformation. If you were living in fear of regulations, you were not truly engaged in genuine spiritual practice. Steiner also wanted you to understand how to get out of this error, if you recognized that you were in it. According to Steiner, the first step was to genuinely awaken. It was understanding that the Sabbath was about much more than behavioral compliance. It was understanding that there was genuine spiritual work that should be happening. And then, once you understood this, the second step was to start actually doing this work. It was about starting to create space during the Sabbath for genuine elevation of consciousness. It was about starting to dedicate yourself genuinely to practices that could truly connect you with spiritual realities. Practices like genuine meditation, deep contemplation, connection with nature in a way that raised your consciousness, study of genuine spiritual truths. And through doing this genuine work, through truly cultivating heightened states of consciousness, you can begin to truly experience what the Sabbath should be like. Steiner also had an important teaching that this error was universal. It was not just among Adventists. According to Steiner, this pattern, this focus on behavioral regulation rather than genuine spiritual transformation, was found in many religious traditions. It was found among Catholics who focused on following rules about what was allowed on Sunday. It was found among Muslims who focused on rules over observance. It was found in Hinduism and Buddhism and many traditions. And therefore, according to Steiner, it was not a question of judging any particular tradition. It was a matter of understanding a very deep human pattern, a pattern in which people tended to miss the genuine spiritual point in favor of behavioral conformity. And this was an understanding that was extremely important for anyone who genuinely wanted to evolve spiritually. Steiner also offered a final lesson about the opportunity in recognizing this error. According to Steiner, if you really understood this, if you really woke up to the fact that you had been focused on things that didn't truly matter while you were missing the genuine point, this created extraordinary opportunity, because now you can genuinely refocus, being able to genuinely start doing genuine spiritual work, being able to genuinely transform your religious life from something that was centered on rules to something that was centered on genuine transformation. And this could truly change everything. It could transform your relationship with spirituality. It could open doors to genuine spiritual growth. It could free you from a prison you had been living in, a prison disguised as religious observance, And now Steiner offered a teaching that was particularly important. He said there was something very profound happening in the spiritual realms during the Sabbath, during that special day of the week. According to Steiner, there were genuine cosmic forces, higher spiritual intelligences, that were especially focused on that day. And the reason was that the Sabbath had originally been designated, by very ancient wisdom, as a day when humanity could genuinely make contact with these higher spiritual realities. He could genuinely access knowledge that was ordinarily inaccessible. I could genuinely participate in transformation processes that were not ordinarily possible. But this required something very specific. It required you to genuinely open up. It required you to genuinely raise your consciousness. It required that you genuinely create space, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, for that genuine contact. And when you were preoccupied with rules, when your mind was entirely focused on compliance, you were effectively closing those doors. You were stopping yourself from making the genuine contact that should be happening. Steiner also had an extraordinary teaching about how the very act of letting go of rules, letting go of concern about what was permitted and what was prohibited, was itself an act of spiritual transformation. According to Steiner, when you truly free yourself from this rule mentality, when you truly raised your consciousness above that level, you were participating in something very profound. I was participating in the true elevation of consciousness. I was participating in true transformation. Because what was a rule if not an external structure that you had internalized? And when you genuinely freed yourself from that structure, when you genuinely recognized that it wasn't really important, you were freeing yourself from a very real mental limitation. You were expanding your consciousness. You were genuinely evolving. Steiner also wanted you to understand that when he said 90% of Sabbath keepers make this mistake, when he said it was fatal, he was speaking absolutely seriously. According to Steiner, this was no small error. This was not a mistake you could just ignore and continue on your spiritual path. This was a mistake that, if you didn't recognize it and correct it, could truly determine the quality of your spiritual life. Because you were wasting the Sabbath, that extraordinary gift that had been given to humanity. You were wasting a once-a-week opportunity to do genuine spiritual work. You were wasting approximately 1/7 of your life because every week had a Sabbath, on behavioral conformity rather than genuine spiritual transformation. And over the course of a lifetime, that was an extraordinary amount of time. It was an extraordinary amount of wasted opportunity. It was truly fatal to genuine spiritual development. Steiner also had a teaching about what should be happening during the Sabbath, in a more concrete way. According to Steiner, during the Sabbath, you should be engaging in practices that genuinely elevate your consciousness, genuinely spiritual practices. This could be deep meditation, it could be genuine contemplation on spiritual truths, it could be in-depth study of genuine spiritual knowledge. It could be deep connection with nature, in a way that was uplifting, inspiring, transformative. It could be time in genuine spiritual community, not community centered on rules and conformity, but community centered on genuine transformation and evolution. It could be genuine service, an act done out of pure love and compassion without expectation of reward. It could be genuine creativity, expression of your true being. The point was that Saturday time should be devoted to something that was genuinely uplifting, genuinely transformative, genuinely spiritual. No to rules, not conformity, not the worry about what was allowed. Steiner also offered a teaching on how you can know if you are actually doing genuine spiritual work during the Sabbath. According to Steiner, there were certain signs that indicated you were on the right path. One sign was that you felt genuinely different during the Sabbath. Different in a profound way. There was an uplifting quality. There was a feeling that you had genuinely accessed something that was bigger than yourself. There was an expansion of consciousness. Second sign was that you felt renewed. Not just physically because you had rested, but genuinely renewed in your soul. There was a sense of genuine healing occurring. Third sign was that his life, for the rest of the week, was different. May you be able to apply the heightened awareness that you had accessed during Saturday. May you be able to live in a way that was more aligned with your true nature. May you be more loving, wiser, more genuinely yourself. When these signs were present, it indicated that you were truly doing the genuine spiritual work of the Sabbath. Steiner also had an important teaching for those who felt guilty, who felt like they were doing something wrong because they recognized that they were focused on rules rather than spiritual transformation. According to Steiner, you shouldn't feel guilty. You should, instead, feel grateful. Because you had awakened. You had recognized the error, and now you had the opportunity to genuinely change, to genuinely start doing genuine spiritual work. And this was the most important thing that could happen. Because recognition was the first step of transformation. And now that you have recognized it, you can genuinely begin to transform your relationship with the Sabbath. Being able to genuinely start transforming your spiritual life. Because this was the truth that Rudolf Steiner was revealing. regarding the Sabbath and the error made by 90% of observers. That the error was so fundamental, so contrary to the genuine essence of what the Sabbath was supposed to be, that Steiner had been genuinely frightened at the thought. Understand the implications. And the mistake was this, that people had identified Sabbath observance with behavioral conformity, with following a set of rules rather than with genuine spiritual transformation. And so, while they were congratulating themselves about observing, while they were feeling virtuous about following the rules, they were completely wasting the most precious opportunity that came each week. I was wasting my Saturday. I was wasting time when that genuine contact was more easily achievable. Steiner also wanted you to understand that this was not just an Adventist problem. According to Steiner, this error had infiltrated many religious traditions. It had become so common that it was considered normal, considered correct, considered being religious. But according to Steiner, this was a fundamental perversion of true spirituality. Because true spirituality was never about following rules. It was always about genuine transformation. It was always about raising consciousness. It was always about genuine contact with higher spiritual realities. And when you reduce this to a set of behavioral regulations, you've completely missed the point. You had turned something that was meant to free you into something that was actually imprisoning you. Steiner also offered a final teaching on hope. According to Steiner, although this error had spread widely, although it had infected many religious traditions, it did not mean you were trapped. It just meant that you had been scammed, that you had accepted a diluted, corrupted version of true spirituality. But now that you were understanding this, you were able to awaken. Being able to genuinely start doing genuine spiritual work. Being able to genuinely transform your religious life from something that was centered on conformity to something that was centered on genuine transformation. And this was extraordinarily important, because your soul, your true spiritual nature, was waiting for it. I was waiting for the moment when you would finally wake up, when you would finally let go of the false structures you had embraced. When would you finally begin to do the genuine work of spiritual transformation that you were truly destined to do? Steiner also had a teaching about what could happen if you genuinely woke up to this and genuinely started doing genuine spiritual work. According to Steiner, there would be extraordinary change in his life. No change at the level of external behavior, although this could also change naturally as a consequence, but genuine change at the level of consciousness. Change in the level of how you perceived reality. Change in the level of how you related to your own spiritual nature. When you genuinely access that contact with higher spiritual realities, when you genuinely elevate your consciousness during the Sabbath, it can radiate throughout your entire week. This could transform how you lived every other 6 days. This can truly transform your life. Steiner ultimately offered this as his urgent call to those who had recognized this error in their own lives. He said that now that you had awakened, now that you had understood the truth about the Sabbath, you had responsibility. Responsibility to genuinely begin to do genuine spiritual work. Responsibility to no longer waste Saturday worrying about rules. Responsibility to genuinely dedicate yourself to spiritual transformation, that deep work that should be happening. And when you responded to this responsibility, when you genuinely began this work, you discovered that you had finally found the true meaning of the Sabbath. I had finally accessed the true power of the Sabbath. The true spiritual journey you were always destined to take had finally begun. And here's the final truth that Rudolf Steiner wanted you to understand. That the error that 90% of Sabbath keepers made was so profound, so fundamental, that it was truly frightening when you saw the magnitude of it. That while people spent their lives, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, focused on following rules about the Sabbath, they were wasting an opportunity that was truly sacred. I was wasting time that had been specifically designated for genuine spiritual transformation. He was wasting the most extraordinary gift that had been given to humanity. And this was tragic. This was regrettable. This was truly frightening to contemplate. But Steiner also offers there was hope. He said it was never too late to wake up. It was never too late to let go of the false structures you had embraced. It was never too late to start, really start, doing genuine spiritual work. From next Saturday, from the next opportunity you had, you will be able to genuinely change. Genuinely being able to do something completely different. Being able to genuinely access what Saturday really was. And when you do this, when you truly do this, you will find that your life is transformed. May your spiritual being blossom in ways you never imagined possible. That the Sabbath truly becomes what it should have been all along, a sacred time of genuine transformation. Steiner also wanted you to know that this understanding, this awakening, this had come to you not by chance. It had arrived because you were ready, because your soul was calling for it, because you had, on some level, recognized that something was missing, that you had been missing something. And now that you understood, You had the opportunity to genuinely begin. And this was extraordinary. This was a blessing. This was exactly what you needed. So get started. This coming Saturday, let go of worrying about rules. Let go of compliance. Let go of the fear about observing properly. And instead, genuinely dedicate yourself to spiritual transformation, to the elevation of consciousness, in contact with genuine spiritual realities. And when you do this, when you truly do it, you will find that the Sabbath becomes something extraordinary. It becomes what it always should have been. It truly becomes the most precious time of your week. It becomes truly sacred. Rudolf Steiner had seen the error. I had understood its magnitude. He was genuinely scared. But he had also understood the solution. And now you understand too. Now you knew. Now you had a responsibility to genuinely wake up and start doing the genuine work. The work for which the Sabbath had truly been appointed. Because you need to understand something very important. Steiner's teaching on this was not empty criticism. It was not a judgment of Adventists or any religious tradition. It was a calling with genuine compassion. It was an awakening to genuine truth. It was an invitation to break out of a prison you had been living in, a prison disguised as religious observance, and into genuine liberation, in genuine transformation, in genuine contact with higher spiritual realities. And this was truly important to understand, that the arrest was disguised, that the error was so subtle that it seemed right. It seemed as if you were being religious. It seemed as if he was observing properly. But underneath, you were being controlled. He was being kept asleep. You were being prevented from doing the genuine spiritual work you were truly meant to do. Steiner had seen this. He had understood the depth of the error. I had seen how it had infiltrated many traditions. I had seen how it had kept people, generations of people, trapped in spiritual ignorance disguised as religious devotion. And this had scared him, because he could see the genuine cost. I could see all that wasted time. I could see all that lost opportunity. But now you know this too. Now you understand. Now you're awake. And therefore, the choice is yours. You managed to carry on as you were, continuing to waste your Sabbath worrying about rules, or you can genuinely awaken, being able to genuinely start doing genuine spiritual work, genuinely being able to access that contact with higher spiritual realities that the Sabbath had been designed to allow. The choice is yours. But now you know. And when you know, you have a responsibility to genuinely wake up and act.